Hi, everyone. Sorry to break up the conversation. I'm Heidi Byrek. I'm the co-founder of the Global Project Against Hate and Extremism, and I was one of the people who helped design the tracks here at the conference on extremism in policing and extremism in the military and among veterans communities. And one of the things that we wanted to do was take a look, those of you who were just in the last panel, take a look at how other countries have dealt with this problem. What's different about the United States? What's similar in other places? Are there lessons that we can learn from other communities and other situations to help us with the problem that I think most people agree is on the upswing in the United States? So to investigate that situation, I invited people who I've been very, very lucky to work with for some time over the years. It was more than 20 years, it seems like now. On extremism and extremist movements in various places. So we're going to first talk about Germany, and then we're going to turn to the experience of the United Kingdom over the years on, sort of racism and policing, extremism and policing. And I'm going to let my illustrious guests say a sentence or so when they begin to speak. But the first speaker is Thomas Grumka, and he is in Dusseldorf, Germany, or somewhere thereabouts. And Thomas, I don't know if you could hear the things that I was already saying, but if you could...
Yes.
Okay, good.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me as well?
Yes, we can hear you.
All right.
But if you could just give a short introduction of yourself and then, talk about the situation in Germany. I just want to let you know one thing, Thomas, because you weren't here for the last hour. We had some of the people who are here in the audience were here for a panel on the situation with extremism and policing here in the United States, the issues over so many jurisdictions, the Capitol Police and their connections to extremism. So that just sort of sets the scene for some of what we just heard. So the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, and good evening from Germany. We are 6 hours ahead here, so it's already evening here. So thank you very much for the invitation. And about my own person, I'm a political scientist. I'm a professor of political science at the University of Police and Public Administration of the state of North Rhine-Westphalia. I will say something about the organizational framework in a minute. And I've been working on the topic of extremism, political extremism, terrorism, really since I was a student, so we are talking, 30 years almost. I've been working on these topics, and so now, of course, being for 10 years a professor at this university, I'm very much also concerned with the question we are having today in this on this panel here, which is there any kind of extremism in the police forces? And I will say something about the German case. Should I just start with my little 5 minutes? Okay. So what I want to do is, especially for an American audience, give a very, very brief organizational framework, what it means when I talk about police in my neck of the woods here. So, of course, we are here in the Federal Republic of Germany, 82 million people, and 16 states of different sizes, not so different like in the US, very different sizes. And North Rhine-Westphalia, the state where I work, is the largest one with 18 million people. In Germany, the police is very much a matter of the state. So we have a federal police, which also has its own training. But I have to say, other than in the US, the training is absolutely uniform in every state and on the federal level. So each of the states have little differences how they train their police, but the differences are not that grand. But in the state, every police person gets exactly the same training. There are no exceptions. So my state with 18 million people is then divided into 47 police districts, 47. Since 2008, in my state, every police person, everybody, has to go through the University of Police, where I work, where I teach, and get a bachelor degree. It's a 3-year bachelor degree, and when I talk about bachelor degree, we call it it's a dual study degree. That means they do not only study at the university where I teach, but also we have then a second module in every of these 3 years where they then go into training on a training ground. They're shooting, all these things. They learn there all kinds of police trade, I would call it. And then the third element then is they going training on the job in the police district where they then later will work. And then this repeats the second year, repeats the third year. As far as the study goes, this not only includes topics like law, of course, which is very important, like any kind of police matter, any kind of topics like that, but also includes political science, which I teach, sociology, which I also teach, psychology, ethics, and things like that. So this is a really well-rounded, I would say, education that every police person that will be here, a police officer in my state, gets before they even start their work. I think this is very important also regarding our topic, because we already talk in our education about many of the topics, and I listened to the last 15 minutes of the last panel, which already concern the topics of racial profiling, of open racism even, or extremism within the police force. So we already have this as a topic in the education. Still we had some incidents in our police, and I will, if there are questions in the audience, I can, of course, elaborate on those a little more, what they were. But I can already say that if somebody is a member of an extremist organization, just what we heard, like the KKK or something like this, they are ex-police in Germany. I mean, this is very clear. This cannot both happen at the same time, that you have an oath on the Constitution, which every police person and every civil servant, for that matter, like myself, has. And at the same time, you're a member of an organization which fights against the values of this same Constitution that you had, put your hand on the Constitution for your oath. It cannot work like that. So this is something that absolutely is clear, absolutely clear. Still, we had some incidents, for example, racist and at some point extremist WhatsApp chats that were, came to light. And in my state, actually, the interior minister, under which fold the whole police is, in the interior ministry, then actually had an executive committee installed last year, and they filed quite a big report, 150 pages or something, where also we as a university worked on with many others, with recommendations how we can further tackle the issues of racism, extremism in the police force, even if we, and I wouldn't say only, in chats, but also, of course, on the streets and everywhere. So we are constantly working on this kind of topic. The last sentence I want to say about it is that one of the recommendations was that we actually install in every of the 47 police districts, as well as at our university, a so-called point of contact, a person that is responsible for the topics of extremism in the relevant organization that they work, and who is somebody who also takes, you can be contacted anytime if somebody wants to talk about these issues or has something that is in their precinct or whatever happened. They can speak to somebody, and of course also because this is what my position is in my university, so I'm the point of contact for extremism at a university. We also offer further education on this. So I, for example, did a whole day with the people who work in the library the libraries, I should say, we have in our university system, because they actually contacted me and said, we don't even know what kind of literature we might be racist, or this kind of thing that we newly buy for our library. So I just gave them, some advice how, what kind of things they should look for. So that's just one example what we are working on. I will leave it at that.
Thank you, Thomas. Very much appreciate it. Paul, you're going to tell us about the UK.
Yeah, so I feel like I'm admitting this, but I'm a police officer by career. I joined the police in the UK in 1984, and after the riots that occurred in Brixton and different big cities in the UK, and I joined in 1984 a police force. I stopped being an active police officer in 2014, and what I left was a police service. And that changed from being a force where your tactics are about controlling parts of the community to protect others, to being a service is built on a fundamental principle of human rights. So we effectively would argue in policing in the UK that we are a human rights protection organisation foremost, and that everything else follows from that. And we have certain principles that we adopted because of tragedies, because of things going wrong. One of them is the issue about equitable delivery of services. And I would argue, and we would argue, that equality isn't about doing the same for different people. It's about outcomes. If it's safe for me to walk from my home to a local shop to fetch milk in the evening, it should be safe for somebody who's transgender or somebody who's disabled or somebody from a minority ethnic group. So you have to do more to protect the people who are more at risk. So delivering that is really important. In the mid-80s, I would characterise that we were at war with parts of our population, and particularly the ethnic minority parts of the population. The UK, because of its history, has got a very diverse communities in the cities, and we'd allowed ourselves to become in policing on a war footing, effectively. Now, my argument is that you can't expect a war to end without work, and you can't expect communities to change. It's got to be the state who makes that change, who builds that confidence up, that they are there for the communities. For us, the change came around because of the tragic murder of a young man called Stephen Lawrence, a young black boy, an 18-year-old, who was murdered in an unprovoked racist attack in South London in 1993. And his murder wasn't high profile. It wasn't a police officer that did it, I hasten to add. But it wasn't high profile until around 96, 97, when the family's tireless campaign for justice, because they were not treated properly, because Stephen's murder wasn't being investigated as a racist crime that it should have been, because the police officers had got preconceived ideas that because of where he was and where he was at the time of the day, because of the location, they'd made presumptions that he was involved in gang behaviour, that he was involved in drugs behaviour. So we were effectively put under a public inquiry and challenged in a way that's dominated my career. It's undoubtedly the most significant change in that period of time. And one of my colleagues characterised it as we as the police were on the floor, face down, being kicked from the back. And it was almost an existential challenge to our authority in society. So we really did need to change, and senior officers recognised the need for change. Change is much easier in a smaller country like the UK. We don't have, like you've just heard in Germany, a federal system. We've got 43 operationally independent chief officers who are operationally independent. And even getting them to agree something is like herding cats under normal circumstances. So how US changes with 17,700 organisations is obviously a huge challenge. So how we did it is there were 7 steps, I think I would identify, that we took to try and change that. And it's taken a generation. I don't believe the things we saw in the last event could happen in the UK without a police officer being fired. There, as we just heard in relation to Germany, there is just no expectation that anybody could make a racist post on Twitter or be part of a racist organisation and maintain their presence in the police in any format. So we had, to make that change, there had to be a really strong policy. There had to be a sign-up from the executives and from the ministers and from the community in general. But it needed charismatic leaders who were capable of transforming organisations. And a friend of ours, John Grieve, who was appointed to effectively rescue the police's reputation in the UK, is one of those charismatic career cops who's got a fantastic attitude to human rights, but has also got the charisma to be able to change. So he set around doing that, and I've kind of picked out 7 policies that changed it. The first is about setting the standards. You've got to make it clear what the line in the sand of behaviour is. That obviously to change people's attitudes is a generation. It requires a generation of change. But you can change the behaviour from day one. So you make it clear, under no circumstances will you make a racist joke and get away with it. Under no circumstances will you display racism to a member of the public and get away with it, or to a colleague and get away with it. So you do that and you make it clear that you have a zero tolerance to that bigotry, regardless of its name. And then you enforce it, and you have to enforce it strongly, and you have to enforce it robustly, and that's the next stage of that. The third one is about recruitment and retention of minority staff. So recruiting becomes really important. To weed out the people who we've heard in the previous session who would want to join because their ego, because of their position, because it would be an ideal place to abuse their position. You've got to weed them out. You've got to have those systems. But you've also got to make it an appealing place. And changing that internal culture, which criminologists used to refer to as the canteen culture, is a real challenge and takes real time. So you then need to root out bad apples. So we had, and it's similar to what Thomas just talked about, we had the leak, somebody hacked the British National Party, a racist nationalist party in the UK, some time ago, and they took the membership list and they published it. And there was 2 police officers, one police officer and one police support worker, to my knowledge, who were on the list. They were fired immediately. It was clear that they couldn't be part of it, and they were fired. So having that kind of rooting out the bad apples becomes a proactive task, as well as obviously one that encourages the reporting. And we allow anonymous reporting of things like that on web facilities. Then you've got to have a wide-ranging review of policy. So I won't go into too many, but things like appointing family liaison officers for the victims of serious crime, so that there is a person who is seen as on their side, who is capable of interpreting what's going on. Because in a tragedy, families are concentrating on the family and on the tragedy and on the important things in their life, and they don't want to worry about judicial processes and court processes and inquests. So having those dedicated family liaison officers is one of them. And then the next stage was about finding what John talked about as the practical cop elements. So don't concentrate just on the higher level stuff. Concentrate on why it's about being a better cop, and talk to them about the need for things like addressing domestic abuse and child sex abuse within minority communities, and the fact that those communities will never come to you for support if they don't trust you for everything. So the policies were really robust, and the practicalities of doing the job well was sold to the police officers. And I just want to pick out about hate crime, because it's been mentioned earlier. The reporting of hate crime was recognised in the inquiry as a fundamental flaw in our system, that we weren't getting to hear about hate crime. And we have put immense efforts to encourage victims to come forward. And I've just got some data for you, which just highlights, and this is not to embarrass those of us from the States, but it's to talk about what can be done over that generation. So in terms of hate crime, from the FBI data in the last data set that's available, Alabama recorded 27 hate crimes in a year, Illinois 75, Louisiana 39, Mississippi 16, Pennsylvania 81. The Metropolitan Service in London recorded 26,993. It recorded 3 times as many hate crimes in London alone, 30 miles by 40 miles maybe. It recorded 3 times as many as the entire US, with 7 times the population of our country. So it shows that what can be done if it's done thoroughly and if it's done robustly. And to finalise, my last final point, it has to be done in partnerships. The partnerships that we've seen talked about here are essential, and I would have really liked to have seen a significantly greater police presence here, because these partnerships and these relationships and these inspirational people that I've met here are absolutely key to it. And the partnership with civil society and the partnership with affected victims' communities and with academia is absolutely essential to having that confidence, finding the route and finding the answers to these issues. And I'll hand over seamless, if I may, to Mike, who is part of that partnership. We're one of our key partners for as long as I've been involved in hate crime policy, and he will talk about how that works in real time from your perspective, hopefully.
Thanks, Paul. I'm Mike Wine. I was one of the founders of the Community Security Trust, the CST, which is the security agency of the Jewish community, and I worked for them for 35 years. In that time, I was asked to join let me just then say that I have a British government appointment at the Council of Europe, which is the human rights agency of the wider Europe, that's wider than the European Union. It's 46 member states. It was 47, but we kicked Russia out. And I'm involved there in inspecting governments and writing policy advisories to governments on certain human rights issues. So let me backtrack. Many years ago, in fact, before Paul was involved, I was invited to join the Independent Advisory Group on Hate Crime, which was one of the outcomes of this Stephen Lawrence judicial inquiry into the racist murder of this young black lad, Stephen Lawrence. And we advised the police. Initially, we were part of the Ministry of Justice. We now work to the National Police Chiefs Council. Amongst the things we do is, under Paul's management, not direction, but management, we go into police stations and we sit with an officer and we go through their crime reports. Are officers out on the beat reporting the crimes? Are they reporting them correctly? Are they noting the bias element, if it exists? And we produce a report which goes to the Chief Constable. For many years, until COVID, I was also a member of the Hate Crime Scrutiny Panel of the London Crown Prosecution Service. The CPS is the National Prosecution Service in the UK, and it's divided in much the same way as the police are. London obviously being the widest and in fact the largest, and it's since been divided into two, CPS North and CPS South, north and south of the River Thames, which divides London laterally. And there again we would go into the prosecution files. We were self-directing. They would present to us. I have to say, we had to sign the Official Secrets Act. All the notes that we made, all the files that we read, had to stay within CPS headquarters, not allowed to take anything out. But we would be presented with, say, 2 dozen cases involving hate crime, and we would say, right, we'll look at this one, we'll look at that one, and we'll look at this one. And we'd spend a day going through the prosecution reports, the police reports, the court reports. This is post-judgment, of course, but often quite rapidly after judgment. We were led in matters of law by Treasury Counsel, senior government lawyer, and again we would pronounce a verdict on how well those cases were being conducted by the prosecution service. I have to say, in most cases, they were being conducted very well indeed, and they were picking up all the elements. There were a couple where, had I been the judge, I'd have thrown them all out and sacked the lot, but really, it was a couple over the many cases that we looked at. And lastly, Paul and I were members, although I don't think Paul attended more than one meeting, of the National Review of Hate Crime undertaken by Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary. A quaint name, but it's the Inspectorate of Policing in the UK. They also added on the fire service, and they conducted a year-long inquiry into how a number of police forces were dealing with hate crime. So those were the different things that we were doing in those statutory bodies. Another element that you should be aware of is the data sharing process. Ourselves, or my former colleagues at CST, collect data on anti-Semitic hate crime. And clearly the police were, but there was a huge variance between what was being reported to the CST and what was being reported to the police. Victims felt unwilling, afraid to go to the police station. They might not have known that the crime of which they were a victim was a hate crime. They knew it was a crime, but not necessarily regarded as a hate crime. So after much public criticism in the media because of the differential in data sets, we and the police signed a contract, a data sharing agreement to exchange data on hate crimes. Now, it has to conform with European data protection legislation, so all the information will be handed over both ways, from the police to us and us to the police, but we omitted the names. So from time to time, my colleagues would sit down with the representatives of the police and say, right, incident number ABCD, and the police would say, yeah, we've got most of that, but we're missing some elements. Please send us what you've got. And the police would say to us, incident number XYZ, and we would say, yeah, we've got all of it, but can you sort of give us a bit more if you've got it? So in that way, the CST and the police were publishing more or less similar sets of data. The fly in the ointment was that the police worked to a different 12-month period to that. We worked to a December or January to December, and they do the financial year. But essentially, we were publishing roughly similar sets of data. That's called True Vision. It's the contract which we signed and which the Muslim organisation, LGBT organisation signed, are all available on the police website, which is called True Vision, and you can look at it. Let me just go a little bit wider. As I said, I had European responsibilities, and in one example of that, I helped write the manual on investigating hate crime for CEPOL. CEPOL is the European police agency you probably haven't heard of. You will have heard of Interpol, which relates to the United Nations and has a worldwide coverage. Europol is the European police agency, which has an operational role, but which is primarily involved in gathering intelligence submitted to it by national police forces, and they publish a very good annual report. But CEPOL is the European Union Agency for Law Enforcement Training. CEPOL is in fact the French for European Union Agency, etc. So I went to Budapest, where the headquarters, and with cops from the Netherlands, Spain and Portugal, we spent 3 or 4 days drafting a training program for European police officers on how to investigate hate crime. The other thing that I can mention is that I've been involved, and so has Paul, in the OSCE Words into Action program. The OSCE, of which the US is a member, is the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. It's a regional security agency. So much of its work is dealing with security and interstate matters, but it has a human dimension agency, and that is involved in training police and prosecutors. So I was involved in developing this Words into Action program to teach cops and prosecutors how to recognize and investigate anti-Semitic crimes. Similar programs exist for racism generally, but I had the most to do with the Words into Action program. And lastly, as I said, I'm the UK member of a Council of Europe Standing Commission, which advises governments, and we do this by publishing general policy recommendations on specific areas covered by the European Convention on Human Rights. But we also do 5-yearly country inspections. And our reports are probably the standard human rights report on a country. They're done on a 5-yearly basis, they're incremental, so we would look at what was done 5 years ago and then take it on. And there's a follow-up. We make recommendations, and we make 2 or 3 special recommendations which the government has to enact within 2 years, and we go back and inspect. There are no hard sanctions, unlike the European Commission, but there are fairly compelling soft sanctions, and amongst the areas we look at is racism in policing. So there is a policy recommendation to the governments on how to deal with racism. There are a range of others as well: anti-Semitism, anti-Muslim hate, anti-LGBT hate, and so on. 18 in all. I think 18 in all. We're just doing one now on LGBT issues, and we will probably involve trans in that as well. But I'm not involved in that. But as you can see, and the point that I'm making is that there is a higher degree both of governmental and civil society oversight on the way that the criminal justice agencies, and I include both the police and the prosecution service, deal with hate speech and hate crime.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Paul. You know, I'm sitting here listening to all 3 of you, and it makes me feel like the American policing system is some sort of juvenile system. I mean, I'm not trying to be brutal, but we have all this oversight, this government involvement, the efforts at hate crime, the professionalism of the university where you're at, Thomas, the civic involvement is so radically different, right, than we have in the United States, where we essentially have thousands and thousands of fiefdoms with their own policies, some departments with better culture, some not with culture, not with good culture, and this complicated milieu, and really no clear policy path to address it, at least at this point. So let me take moderator's privilege just to ask one question of you folks and then one of Thomas. After the Lawrence report came out, was there like a reaction within police departments against those changes? I mean, was it difficult to make a transition to enact those policies?
So there's obviously individuals who didn't like it. There was people who'd been in policing for 30 years. There was people who would just kind of joined shortly after the war, who were kind of sort of still there. So there was people who didn't like it. They just had 2 choices. They could obviously hold what views they want to hold in the privacy of their own mind. They just realised they couldn't express them, and once you control the behavioural element of it, it becomes embedded. So in the early 90s we had an issue around LGBT hostility. So the kind of some of the historic laws were about criminalising same-sex activity. So we wanted to change that. So one of the things we wanted to do is become inclusive to LGBT staff to join the police. So we set up networks of people who were already in the police, gay and lesbian staff who were there, but hiding their sexual orientation from the work life. And we put up posters to talk about the new groups that were set up. And I insisted that in the era as I was working, that if we put these up, they had to be checked every single day by a senior officer. And if anybody put graffiti on them, they would be taken down and replaced by another one, and they would be taken down and replaced by another one until they were accepted. We didn't get a single example in the county I worked at of sort of 2,500 cops. We didn't get a single example of graffiti, and I thought that was fantastic. And it was the learning that had gone from the Stephen Lawrence inquiry and the race element that was so easily applied then to the other types of hostility. So there is individuals. We still have racist officers. We still have officers who act out racist, but they just know that they wouldn't survive if they get exposed. And it's that the cultural change is always the bit that lays behind. So there was somebody, John Grieve, who works with us as an advisor now, having long retired, A senior police officer said to him last year, "Oh, John, you're not still banging on about Stephen Lawrence." And he said, "Well, have you just missed what's happened in your career? This was the most fundamental change to policing in the last 100 years. And if you don't see it as a very real issue," I have to say, when the inquiry started, we used to say, "Oh, it's just the Met." I was a regional sort of officer in a suburb, and it's just the Met. They're different. They all get it all wrong. We used to have a phrase in policing, and excuse the foul language, but it said, "To err is human, but to really fuck it up, you need the Metropolitan Police Service." And we just thought they were different because they were bigger. But the reality of it is, Stephen Lawrence was as much about us as it was about them, and it took us a couple of years to realise it. It was about everything we do. It's about the fundamentals of policing and how you fit in a society. So it's not lost on anybody, and it's still talked about now. My son, who is now a mid-ranking police officer, will still get challenged about his ability to deliver fair services to minority communities because of the failings of Stephen Lawrence's murder. And Dan was 7 when Stephen was murdered. So it goes beyond a generation. Getting it right, somebody will go and tell 6 of the friends that they've had a good experience with the police. Getting it wrong, and we're still talking about it 2 generations later.
Yeah, well, there's quite the lesson in that. I thought also about those hate crime statistics that you mentioned, Paul. And, Mike, you've dealt with police forces in all these different countries on the issue of hate crimes. We have a situation in this country where there's appears to be not just benign neglect in terms of hate crimes reporting, but like a certain hostility depending on parts of the country that you're in. The state level hate crimes laws often don't include the LGBTQ community if you're talking about the South. There are these patterns, and we know that only about 5% of American hate crimes are actually reported, partly because it's often looked at in correlation with UK data. And I'm just wondering if you find that kind of hostility to collecting this data, prosecuting hate crimes in other places, or what your experiences along those lines have been.
I think it's changing. I think when I started, what I encountered was indifference. But now, because European police forces are being scrutinized, there's a change in attitude. What prevents a national police force from producing robust data now is usually because there's no political leadership from the government, or they're not given the facilities and the money to do it. So, for example, we did police training we did the Council of Europe inspection of Greece in November of last year. We're publishing the report at the end of this week. And I was talking to police officers to say, well, you're recording hate crime, and what's the process for sending your reports to the prosecution service? Have you got a computer program? I said, no, we don't have the money for computers. We're handwriting stuff, and then it either gets couriered or posted. The UK went on to a computerized system some years ago, so it made it easier and cheaper. But I would say that most European countries, because there is a strategy produced by the Council of the European Union, and which they will be inspected on, are having to improve. And they're having to improve quite quickly. So the colleagues in CEPOL, who are police officers, are very busy training cops around Europe to work these systems much better. But I would say if there is a shortfall these days, it's really because they lack resources, or there isn't the political push from above to get the job done. Generally, the police want to do a good job. In some cases, they say, yes, anti-Semitism, we'll deal with anti-Semitism. But you start talking to them about hate crime against Roma communities, and they don't want to know. Or they make anti-Roma comments as well. The Roma are the community that suffers the worst in Europe. Probably or possibly because they're a transitory community, they're moving around, their kids don't get decent schooling because of the parents moving, because they tend to live outside the main cities, or if they're in the cities, they're living in pretty poor conditions, and they're easy prey for racists. And the police don't really put themselves out investigating crimes against those communities.
Interesting. Thomas, I just wanted to ask you, maybe there's a short answer to this and then I can get a couple of questions from the audience. The police officers in recent last few years who have been shown to have extremist ties of some sort and have been tossed, right, from the police force in Germany. Has there ever been a case where people sort of knew this was going on with some of them, or was the leadership completely unaware of their activities until they were disclosed in some way?
Yeah, we had also these cases as well. I mean, I can only echo what Paul said, that this is, of course, what I'm talking about now is the end point of a long development. I mean, it didn't happen overnight. Also, this in the police, this recognition that there is a problem, that this must be addressed, that it cannot be, swept under the rug. But it still happens. That's true. Leadership is a very, very important element of this. But we see cases where the superiors of police officers know about it and do not say anything about it. I mean, there is also there are studies done on what in the US you call cop culture. This idea that you are in a sort of closed shop situation where you have to be, where you have solidarity only amongst each other, and you cannot say something negative about your colleague or your fellow policeman, and you have to all stick together no matter what, So this still exists as well, but like you said, I mean, usually when these things are prosecuted, then there is a very clear result. I mean, we in Germany have two tracks. It's either criminal prosecution. If, for example, somebody posts a swastika under German law, that's illegal, then you cannot be in the police anymore. That's it. But if it is below this kind of criminal prosecution, we also have a civil servants sort of law. I don't know if you can say it like this in English, where also myself as a civil servant, we have certain regulations where when I fail to fulfill my oath and things like that, I can be punished in several ways. I mean, I can be degraded in my rank, not me, but a police person could, or I can even get a pay cut. So if the result is it's not a criminal investigation that we can do, but an inner police investigation, and they say, okay, there was a racial slur or something like this, but the police itself can decide that somebody has to live with a pay cut. So that would be an inner police sanction. Yeah. All these things have been put into action.
That's interesting. All right. Well, I didn't pick up the iPad, so if there's a question from the crowd, I'll repeat it here. If anybody has a question. Yeah.
Thank you. That's a wonderful presentation. I'm a little bit familiar with the efforts in the UK after the 90s. I know something about the European police colleges, and those always seem very impressive to me. But what do you do? I'm not so familiar with the general political scene in Europe right now, but this is an Eradicate Hate conference, right? And we're in a moment in America and in Pennsylvania right now, to look at the governor race, where hatefulness is kind of very popular among a huge portion of the population. How do you address that when that's so powerful? You have some police officers that might be doing some street stuff, way more, learn the more basic stuff. But in the previous panel, Vita mentioned that we want the best people to become police officers in this country, but we don't do anything to make the best people want to become police. We want cheap, efficient, follow the Constitution, and by the way, don't be racist, even though you're a product of a racist culture. Where do we even start with that?
Well, you've just given me a complicated question to. It's all right.
Just from my side, I couldn't hear anything,
Yeah,
so you
I'm
need to
gonna-
repeat it, please.
Yeah, I'll repeat it, Thomas. The question is really about increasing sort of racism and extremism in the mainstream in the United States, and how does that affect sort of and also, I guess you were talking about in general in other places, and how does that affect things like recruitment? How do you get the best police officers? You know, the U.S. situation, of course, is quite volatile right now, especially in the run-up to the elections. Maybe you all could say something about recruitment,
Sure.
actually.
Well, if I could give an example to the core point. So we've all seen that nationalism and populism and nationalist populism have been successful around the world. They have been a successful election tool. So there is by necessity it's a matter of dealing with those. I'll give an example from a country I won't name if you don't mind, but for 11 years I've been going to a country that was formerly part of the Soviet Union that emerged out of that and fell out with the Russian Federation and looked to the West for guidance on how to deal with things. And it hadn't got a response to hate crime and was being challenged in the European Court. So Mike talked about the European Court of Human Rights had found it guilty of failing to protect LGBT communities and that stuff. And they came to kind of the organisations that Mike talked about and said, "Can you help us? We want to get this right." So they put 10 years of work in, and a number of us have gone and worked with police to train, prosecutors to train. We've put data systems in place, legislation's been put in place. Over a 10, 11-year period, a real load of work has been done. And their government became a populist government 2 or 3 years ago and went really far back. And they banned the Pride March that had only taken place since this change. And they banned it because they said they couldn't keep it safe. And so the gay community stayed out, but the journalists went in and the neo-Nazis went in. So the neo-Nazis attacked the journalists and the photographers who weren't gay unless by coincidence. So they went and attacked them. Even in this time where the government is rolling back on the commitments that previous governments have made, the 31 people were seriously injured, including a journalist who died from his injuries. And the police and the prosecution service prosecuted 41 neo-Nazis, and they charged them with LGBT hate crimes. Even though the victims weren't gay, they said that the motivation for the crime was anti-LGBT hostility. So for me, I found that one of the most heartwarming things to see, because you put the systems and structures and training in place and get the right people in place, that even in bad times, people will still do what's right. They'll be going against the flow, but they'll have the confidence and the character to be able to do it. And I just found it fantastic that was that was better than I expected to happen. So it's about putting the structures in place, putting the judiciary in place, putting the police and the policy in place. And once you've done it, it will survive rocky roads, I guess.
We're going to have to call it there because we're at time. But these two wonderful guests are here if you've got questions about anything having to do with Europe. Thomas, thank you so much for joining us. I wish you could hang out here and talk to folks about the German political system and policing. But if anybody has questions for Thomas, let me know and I can put you in contact with them. So thank you very much. Thank you, guys.